بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Salam, hello, bonjour. This is Adnan Hussein, professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you all with us today. We have a really interesting program and discussion today with a wonderful guest who I'm about to introduce in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to ask you, this is a new channel. I want to ask you if you would like, subscribe, and share this video and any other videos that you discover on the YouTube channel. If you're a podcast listener, please rate and review. It's available on all the usual platforms. It'll be a great help. And of course, if you want to support the cause and allow me to continue to do content and have a wonderful producer editing video for me, you can also support me at patreon.com/Adnan Hussein and help defray the costs of this continuing public educational project. But without further ado, let's get to our discussion, because I'm really excited to be able to welcome to the program Dr. Marchella Ward, Chella for everybody, who is a lecturer in classical studies, but I think she would prefer to characterize it as critical ancient world studies, which is a book she co-edited and has a very important contribution in. And perhaps she'll tell us a little bit about that and how it relates to the particular topic today. But she teaches at the Open University in the UK. She's the author of a major book on, Greek theater. I guess we could characterize it as that, but on disability studies in Greek drama and other periods of drama. But it's also somebody who is a co-host of Radio Reorient and is involved with the Critical Muslim Studies Project, which is how we came to know about one another. And so, Chella, it's great to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me.
Wa alaikum salam. It's our pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation because I heard you recently give a very interesting short lecture and discussion about the word intifada as a philologist, as it related to a case of its use and the criminal prosecution of its use in France. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could first start with telling us a little bit about how you came to respond in the fashion that you did at the encampment at Radboud University to the tendentious kind of use of and controversy over an activist's use of the word intifada and subsequent prosecution in France.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're totally right that this was a conversation that we first had at this encampment, pro-Palestine encampment at the University of Radboud in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, which is this amazing kind of activist space where the students, like many students on encampments at universities across the world, are just doing enormous educational work. And one of the things they're doing as part of that really important educational work is this kind of teach out kind of protest style education where they invite various specialists to give talks. And they'd invited me to say something about the word intifada as it relates to the prosecution of Elias D'Imzalène, who's a pro-Palestinian, anti-Islamophobia, anti-genocide activist in France. And the case basically revolves around this use of the word intifada. What happened was on the 8th of September, 2024, Elias is said to have said the words, "Are we ready to carry out an intifada in Paris, in the banlieue, in our neighborhoods?" And the presumption that's being made, or the accusation that's being made, is that this call for an intifada in the streets of Paris was implicitly a call for violence. That's the argument that's being made against him, is that this was some form of violent speech, some form of hate speech. Some, in the very right wing, often very Islamophobic French press have even characterized it as itself a call for physical violence, as terrorism, as antisemitism, all these various kinds of words that circulate in what is an extremely Islamophobic climate in France at the moment. And I was really interested in this case as a classical philologist. I'm a trained classical philologist. I read Greek and Latin at the University of Oxford. That's very much my training, is in the most traditional forms of classical philology. And I was just fascinated by this question that the case is asking, which is, how do words make meaning? Who controls what words mean? Because if you can put somebody on trial with the presumption that their words are hateful, then you can essentially make a judgment about what those words mean. And this, in philological terms, is really very interesting, because what you're doing when you say that is you're taking away the agency of the person using the words. You're saying, okay, the person who uses the words doesn't dictate their meaning. And you're saying someone who heard those words instead ought to dictate that meaning. And in this case, it's particularly fascinating because there was no violence that resulted from this call for intifada, right? So in that sense, the idea that this call for intifada was in itself a call for violence has no bearing on reality, because there was, alhamdulillah, thankfully there was no violence on the streets of Paris that day as a result of this call for intifada. So then I think we have to ask the question, how is meaning made? Because when Elias made this call, when he said, are we ready to carry out an intifada in Paris? He wasn't, of course, making a call for violence. He understood the word intifada to mean something different to the way that those who later wanted to prosecute him, which include, various Zionist organizations, he understood that word differently to the way those organizations who brought the case against him understood it. He understood that word to mean the whole variety of things that word, in fact, has always meant. I mean, intifada, we can perhaps go into this in a little bit more detail later on, but intifada has always been a word with a huge range of meanings. It means, in Arabic, it's related to the verb that means to shake off, in the sense of shaking off a carpet, shaking the dust off a carpet, for instance. But it's been used really widely to refer to things like strike, for instance, like protest, peaceful protest, like writing, certain kinds of writing, certain forms of knowledge production also that are seen as kind of counter-hegemonic. So when he was using this word, he wasn't calling for violence. What he was doing was calling for peaceful resistance, right? For peaceful protest, calling at a protest for the kind of furthering of that form of peaceful protest. But he was nonetheless told that the word he had said, in fact, meant something different to what he had himself meant by it. And that, to me, as a kind of philosophy of language question, as a what might be called a semiotic question, that's to say a question that turns around what words mean or how meaning is made, that was a really, really fascinating question.
Well, that's very interesting to consider how your scholarship and training in ancient languages might have given you methods and approaches for tackling this question of how words make meaning and how to interpret and understand them in their full range of possible usages. I'm wondering, perhaps maybe for listeners who are less familiar with that kind of training and the discipline that we are terming, we're not terming, but it has been termed and we're using that discipline of philology. Maybe you could tell a little bit more about what's involved and what kind of approach and study of language it undertakes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a tricky question, Adnan, as you no doubt know, because there are about as many different understandings of the term philology as there are philologists, I would say. The word is usually said etymologically, and I'll come back to some of the problems of defining words etymologically in just a second. But the word is usually said etymologically to mean something like the love of words from the Greek. Obviously that breaks into two halves, philos, love, logos, word. That's the same word as you get in the Bible. In the beginning was the word. The word for word is logos. So in that sense, it's a branch of study that is about words. It's often understood synonymously with something like comparative linguistics, or particularly comparative historical linguistics. So this is the branch of study that is interested in how languages relate to one another. in that sense, it's sort of interesting and surprising in a way that philology should be able to do this kind of pro-Palestinian political work that I'm going to, in the course of our conversation, put it in the service of doing, because it has been very often extraordinarily dangerous and often, the cause of various kinds of racism, because the kind of normative way in which philology has been organized, I usually say philology has been understood as a kind of race science for languages, right? Because the way it has been organized is often to arrange languages into kind of genealogical family trees, where people will say things like, European languages are descended from Latin, and that these belong to the larger language group of, what is sometimes called Proto-Indo-European. That's to say, the hypothesized very early language group that includes, for instance, Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, all those different sorts of ancient languages. It's a branch of study that exists across various different disciplines, or at least now exists across various different disciplines. So a classical philologist is usually somebody who studies Latin and Greek. That's the most kind of normative version. Sometimes they also study Sanskrit. Sometimes they study Phoenician, Akkadian, Sumerian, various other kinds of ancient languages. Then you've got sort of comparative philologists who maybe look at contemporary languages and the way that those relate to each other. And they're interested in linguistic change, but they're especially interested in relation. I think of philology most importantly as a way of studying relation between languages. And this is where I think it gets also its radical potential from. I say potential very carefully because I don't think that all philology is radical. In fact, as I've said, I think it is often, unfortunately, responsible for, this kind of civilizational thinking where people get themselves or kind of trap themselves in loops where they think that it's precisely because Greek is able to express the idea of democracy that the Greeks end up, and the whole West after them, ends up being democratic. So philology is absolutely, in service of all sorts of problematic kinds of civilizational thinking, clash of civilizations thinking, racist thinking, Islamophobic thinking. So I'm certainly not here making the case that philology is always a force for good. But where I think it gets this radical potential from is that if you study language, once you understand language to be more than simply the exchange of words, but really a kind of piece of detective work around meaning and how meaning is made, what you really end up studying is relation. You end up studying, the ways that ideas come about in relation with other ideas. And obviously the map for that for philologists is language, is linguistics. But this is kind of hugely important for thinking about the way that things relate in the world. And then we're obviously here in the world of post-structuralism, which wanted to sort of reframe how things were related. So I'm aware that I'm being slightly abstract here, but I think the reason I'm doing that is because I want us to understand philology not just as about languages that are fixed and sort of translating into and out of them, but as something that's also interested in how meaning is made. And that's the way in which philology, I think, is important for this case. And just to put some kind of meat on the bones, I'm a vegetarian, that's a strange phrase for me to use, but just to put some kind of meat on the bones of this question, how meaning is made. One of my favorite books as a child was Alice in Wonderland. I absolutely loved it. And in Alice Through the Looking Glass, so sometimes described as the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, there's this really interesting scene where Humpty Dumpty, who's my favorite character, that's not the kind of cool thing to say. You're supposed to say your favorite character is, the caterpillar that's always smoking up and saying these very deep things. But my favorite character in Alice Through the Looking Glass is Humpty Dumpty. And the reason he's my favorite character is it's the same Humpty Dumpty as the one from the nursery rhyme, the egg that sits on the wall, for those who don't know the book. There's this really interesting kind of confrontation between him and Alice that turns around this question of how do words make meaning, right? Humpty Dumpty says to Alice that the word glory means a very good argument. And Alice says, well, no, it doesn't. That's not what the word glory means. And Humpty Dumpty says, but the person who uses the word is the person who gets to decide what the word means. And Alice, of course, doesn't agree. And what is kind of fascinating about this for me is how this really opens up the question of who controls meaning. How do words make meaning, which is a kind of huge question that I don't think philology has ever answered, although I do think philology has always been grappling with this question: how do words make meaning? Because in a sense, Humpty Dumpty has to be wrong. Because if the only person in control of what words mean is the person who uses those words, then we would simply never understand each other. There would be no way of having communication, right? Because communication relies on me using words that you also understand to mean the things I think they mean, or at least close enough to the things that I think they mean that we can have a conversation. And so then comes the question, well, who is in control of what words mean then? And I think this is what's at the core of the case against Elias D'Imzalène is, does he control the word intifada? Do those who hear the word intifada control its meaning? Do those Zionist organizations who weren't even there to hear the word intifada, but later saw an opportunity to bring a case against him, are they the ones who control what the word means? Is meaning fixed or is it movable? And if it's movable, then how does it move? And all of these, I think, are these sorts of really, really productive, really philosophical, and potentially really radical questions that philology opens up around this question of relation.
Right. So if the possibilities for interpreting the meanings of words that philology allows us to understand are not just, say, fixed essential meanings, which is, I think, the more racist oriented and orientalist roots of philology, is that the assumptions they made about words as and language as an expression of culture and civilization established the idea that there were essential sort of truths to languages and cultures that themselves change. And so the act of following the history of a word back to its roots was somehow uncovering its meaning. And I think you mentioned the etymological sort of approach. But if, in fact, it's actually more about a relation, how does that affect the politics of language and what's at stake in how something should be interpreted? Because it seems to me, in some sense, the facts of this case suggest that, as you were alluding, use of the word was made in a public context and setting. It didn't lead to the actions that were assumed about the meaning of the word by hostile receivers of the word and interpreters of the word. But they were making a claim about how the word must be understood that then was to be enforced by law. So even the very idea that there would be a court case that adjudicates the kind of meaning of a word seems, in the perspective of historically changing usages, in the dynamic relation between, speaker and listener, community of people who hear the word and together make the meaning. It seems really strange to have, people who weren't there intervene to determine what it must mean on some other basis and to have this adjudicated before a court of law. So what do you think are the, kind of real stakes involved in applying philology as you're understanding it to rethink this kind of situation and to uncover what's really going on politically, maybe in the implications of these approaches to language and how they're being enforced?
Yeah, I think you're really right to point out that what is going on here, or at least what is at the heart of this case being brought against Elias, is actually totally ahistorical and aphilological too. I'm not sure that's a word, but let's coin it for a second. It kind of flies in the face of the last 100 or so years of work in philology, because it presumes that meaning is inherent in words themselves, right? And this was for a long time, something that held sway in an older version of philology, when we really did think, for a long time, that you could do this kind of archaeological exercise of unearthing meaning from words. And you can track a sort of similar, within literary history, you can track a kind of similar sense of approach to texts, where people would read ancient texts as if if we just read them well enough, we would somehow be able to unearth the true meaning of the text, which must lie latent kind of underneath that layer of text. And you had various literary critics trying to do things like be objective about text and remove themselves from their contemporary prejudices and try to read the text as an ancient Greek would have read an ancient Greek text, for instance. And all of these kind of various thought experiments that were really about this very idea that it's somehow possible to unearth the true meaning within the text. And the same happened, with language. And the fascinating thing about this is that where it got stuck was the question, well, what is it about a word then that carries its inherent meaning? We know that it's not the shape of a word, because in different languages we have different words for the same meaning. The shape of the word chair is no more chair shaped than the shape of the word table, for instance. So there isn't anything, at least consistently, about the shapes of words that would give us all of their kind of hidden meaning. And when we translate terms across languages, we also see that the meaning of the word can't, in fact, be inherent in the word itself, because otherwise translation would be impossible. You would never be able to shift a word outside of that kind of group of letters that makes up the word in one language. So in that sense, that's really the kind of problem with etymology. Etymology was the name given to the idea that it's the history of that group of letters that make up the word that give us the clue to its meaning. And I gave you an example of an etymological definition when I said the word philology is usually understood as two Greek words, one meaning love, the other meaning word. But of course, love of words, is certainly not the only thing that the word philology means, just as love of wisdom is not the only thing that philosophy means, for instance. So this is really a very limited way of understanding meaning. It's also not the way that any philologist, or at least not the only way that any philologist today would say that words make meaning. And the reason for that is because of the intervention of a French academic, a Francophone Swiss academic known as Ferdinand de Saussure. And Saussure, in the kind of early 1900s, was really responsible for what seemed on the face of it a very simple idea, which is that signification, or in other words, the way that words make meaning, is arbitrary. In other words, there's nothing inherently about a word that means a certain thing, except that we have decided as users of this language that it's going to mean that thing. So to give you an example, the word table, let's go back to the example table and chair. The word table doesn't inherently mean table, except for the fact that we as users of this language have agreed that this word means table, right? And that's what I mean when I say language is really about relation, because meaning then comes from these forms of relation. We've then created a community. We've created, what Stanley Fish would call an interpretive community. That's to say a community that is going to interpret this word in the same way. And, for something like table, the interpretive community for the word table is extremely large. Most users of English, wherever they're situated in the world, would use the word table in, broadly speaking, similar ways. Not exactly the same way. What they imagine when they think of a table might be different, but it doesn't have a huge kind of range of signification. When we talk about the word intifada, what we're talking about are different interpretive communities, because you've got, on the one hand, those protesters at the protest in Paris on the 8th of September 2024 that Elias was speaking to, who interpreted intifada much like the way he intended the word intifada. That's to say, they interpreted it as a call for peaceful protest, for boycott and sanction, for pro-Palestinian writing, for pro-Palestinian organizing. They didn't interpret it as a call for violence. We know that because there was no violence. But versus, those organizations who later, seeing this on social media, because there's another kind of shift in the context here, who later, seeing this on social media, interpreted this differently. They interpreted it as a call for violence. So what we learn from this kind of very brief history of how words make meaning, philologically speaking, that I've just taken us on, is that etymology, or the idea that meaning is inherent to words themselves, isn't actually all that useful for understanding signification. We know that from the word intifada also, because not one of those protesters, as far as I can see from the social media footage that's publicly available, not one of them, shook off the dust from their carpet, as they would have done if they had understood the word only in relation to the Arabic verb from which it might etymologically be said to come. So if words don't make their meaning only etymologically, then the question is, what other options do we have? How else do words make meaning? And one option, that is particularly well used in particularly in historical linguistics, is usage. That's to say, words make their meaning because of the ways in which they're used. And this goes back to this idea of interpretive community, because if we understand, as Saussure did, that meaning is not inherent to the word, but comes about in an arbitrary way, because a community sort of makes that decision about the word, then the way to find out what a word means is, of course, to think about, well, how do interpretive communities use these words? And this, for the word intifada, is really a very interesting exercise, because what we see is that the organizations bringing the case against Elias are wrong if we understand meaning to be made from usage. They're wrong to say that the word intifada is always violent or is always anti-Semitic. And just if you don't mind me giving a couple of examples, when we look at the kind of history of uses of this word, we see it kind of early in the or in the kind of 1950s, in around 1958, when it's used of strikes in the port of Basra in Iraq. So uprisings against the Hashemite monarchy. And of course, the Hashemite monarchy does fall eventually, but it's not being used of explicitly violent action. It's being used of strike and of protest and of things like refusal to work for particular kinds of employers. It's then used, of course, of the two Palestinian intifadas. We often use the word intifada as if it's singular in English, but of course, when we talk about Palestinian history, we're usually talking about two intifadas, of which the first one is almost unanimously understood to be made up of multiple different things, right? To be made up of peaceful protest, of strike, of boycott action, of a huge outpouring of writing, liberation writing, meeting, organizing, those kinds of things. The second intifada is usually understood to be the more violent one. So we've already got, within those two uses of the word intifada in the Palestinian context, we've already got this idea that intifada, sometimes means violence, but sometimes means all sorts of other peaceful kinds of protest and uprising. It's used, interestingly, of the Jewish revolt at Warsaw against the Nazis. And this, I think, is a really interesting one. It's still the case that the Holocaust Museum in the US still uses, in its Arabic language guide, it still uses the word intifada to describe the act of protest that, those Jewish protesters were engaged in. So the idea that intifada is always organized against Jewish people is, of course, simply not true. And to say that that is true is, in my mind, extremely anti-Semitic, because it erases, this very, very important history of Jewish uprising against Nazi occupation that I think is really very important. It's used in other interesting contexts too. It's used of the Irish against the British. And it's also used of the uprisings in Paris in May 1968. That's to say that the kind of socialist protest for workers' rights and student rights in that moment in 1968. So I think if we think about the usage of this word, what we see is something very interesting. What we see is that this is a word, I think, that is used predominantly of anti-colonial uprising, and is used of all kinds of uprising, going from the most peaceful, writing books, for example, to armed uprising. And I think that when we look at it this way, when we understand it philologically as making its meaning through usage rather than some kind of fixed or etymological meaning, what we see, I think, is perhaps the reason why it's become such a loaded word. Because once we understand intifada to mean anti-colonial uprising, then we then end up seeing, Palestinian liberation movements within this whole wider network of anti-colonial, decolonial liberation movements. And we also have to understand, Tel Aviv's occupation of Palestine as an occupation that is settler colonial in nature. And I think that perhaps might be what was upsetting the various Zionist organizations that have brought the case against Elias D'Imzalène, is not so much that the word might have been inciting violence, because no violence was incited, but that the word was confirming what, most Zionist organizations don't agree to be the case, which is that Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is a colonial one, and that, anti-colonial uprising is protected under various kinds of international law. You do have the right to rise up against your occupiers. So in that sense, using the word intifada is a way of, first of all, as I said, positioning Palestinian justice movements in conversation with trans-historical global movements for justice. I think that's what's especially good about the fact that the word intifada is also used of Irish uprisings against the British. That makes the case very clearly that this is something anti-colonial. But it also allows us to understand what the occupation under which the Palestinians are living and have been living now for more than 70 years really is. So I think in that sense, what was perhaps bothering those organizations was this really kind of candid way of speaking very clearly about colonial occupation. So this is a word also that does something really useful politically and makes us is almost like an act of refusal of the kind of dominant hegemonic Zionist narratives that would want to say something like Israel is only protecting itself, or the kind of anti-historical or ahistorical narratives that position this current escalation of genocidal violence as if it only began, with October the 7th. So there's some history invested in this word that I think is also really, really important to its meaning. But it's not the history of the letters that make up the word. It's the history of the usages of this word and how it's been meaningful to different kinds of interpretive communities, I think.
Right. So perhaps we could delve a little further into the politics behind the attempt to suppress or criminalize the use of this word that you very usefully contextualized in the history of its usage, the various ways in which it has generated meaning, been used to translate concepts from various theaters of anti-colonial resistance or resistance to occupation, including Jews in Poland and in Warsaw resisting Nazi occupation. That gives a sense that there's a full range of meaning, some of which are obviously threatening to the narratives and the interests of those who have a certain political interest. And so how is this being used to suppress and police pro-Palestinian solidarity? I mean, this isn't the first case where there's been all kinds of controversy. I say controversy, but it's like fake, whipped up controversy in attempts to delegitimize pro-Palestinian solidarity being expressed in various ways, whether it is, for example, chants for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, for example, that early on in the protests was made into a kind of genocidal erasure of Jews, right? Again, the idea that language itself in this case was a violent attack upon a particular community. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you think the approach to language is doing and the politics that it reveals more broadly in the attempt to suppress pro-Palestine solidarity, particularly in Europe and across the West.
Yeah, I think the first thing that it's very, very important to know is that fascism has always been about the control of language. Some of the earliest warning signs that you're living under fascism have been that the meaning of words is reduced and controlled, and that you are told, by those in power what your own words mean. That's a pattern that we see, across various kinds of fascist regimes. It's not a pattern that I have identified myself. Sitting next to me is this little book, Victor Klemperer's The Language of the Third Reich, which he, of course, first wrote in German. This is a philologist, a professor who lived under Nazi Germany, and what he describes in the book is the way that Nazi Germany increasingly took control of certain concepts by reinscribing them linguistically. So he begins with the word heroism, for instance. He talks about the word heroism being given a kind of particularly Nazi pattern, that it no longer could mean, for instance, the heroism of those who rise up against their oppressors, and could only mean, this very, very controlled kind of sense of Nazi rule. And he goes through, it's a really fantastic book. I really, really recommend it. This is really somebody who knew what it was to live under occupation, who knew what it was, to live under fascism, to live in the moment where language was being co-opted, to justify the Holocaust, to justify all sorts of horrific violences against various groups of people. And he describes in this really chilling way the fact that, one of the ways that that you're living under fascism is that we see words hollowed out of their meanings, detached completely from their usage, and reinscribed with new meaning that is controlled by those who are in power. And we have seen that, as you rightly said, Adnan, we've seen that with various pro-Palestinian chants, the banning of From the River to the Sea, for instance, even though, of course, the first use of From the River to the Sea is not by pro-Palestinian groups at all. It's by Israeli ministers. So that chant is in fact a kind of re-co-option, in the same way that we might say the word queer is a kind of re-co-option of a word that was used against a particular community. That's what's happening in that chant too. That's been completely erased in order to use this kind of very vicious rhetoric against pro-Palestinian demonstrators, as if they were arguing, for the genocide of Jewish people in the area from the river to the sea, which of course is not the case and has never been the case for that chant. So there are various kinds of protest chants that have been banned. I think it's also important to put this into the context of other sorts of controls of language that we're seeing fascism be currently responsible for. The same week that I gave the lecture at the encampment at Radboud University, there was also a decision made by the UK's Supreme Court about the question of what the word woman meant. And this, I don't know, perhaps listeners don't know all of the UK context, but this has been sort of bubbling away. And I say bubbling, I don't mean that in any kind of, peaceful way. It's been really sort of violent in the UK, this transphobic rhetoric around wanting to reclaim the definition of the word woman, and wanting to say that woman, which is of course a social category, has always been understood to be a social category, should instead be understood as a biological category. And the reason for doing that is often explicitly to ban trans women from sports, from bathrooms. This is something that the figurehead of this movement in the UK is often said to be J.K. Rowling. That's to say, that author who wrote those little books about the wizards some time ago. But there are a number of other kind of quite high-profile British personalities involved in this as well. And it's sort of often presented as a sort of battle between the biological and the social. But what it really is, what it really comes down to is a philological question. It comes down to a question about language, which is, what does the word woman mean? And of course, in this case that took place in the UK recently, the verdict that was made, or the decision that was come to, was that the word woman does describe a biological category rather than a social one. And this is hugely, hugely violent and damaging, towards trans folks across the country. It's also extraordinarily difficult to implement because, we don't go around in the world understanding people on the basis of their biology. We understand them on the basis of how they socially present themselves. So it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, I think, to police this in any way. But this is yet another example of a word being hollowed out of the huge variety of ways that it's been used, and not just in the UK, but of course around the world, because English, of course, because of the extraordinary violence of the British Empire, linguistically speaking, becomes this kind of lingua franca around the world. So the decisions that are made about the word woman in the UK can have extraordinary consequences, just as the Islamophobic policy that's made in France can have extraordinary consequences, particularly in the places that France colonized. So this is, I think, a really dangerous situation that we're in, where we have got those who are in power attempting to hollow out words, separate them from the meanings that their interpretive communities have attributed to them, including their expert interpretive communities. Many medical experts, experts of gender studies have come out in the last few weeks in the UK to say, not only is this a nonsensical definition of the word woman, it's also totally unworkable in the society in which we live. But this is, of course, a facet of fascism, is that it does precisely this. And the other word that this has happened with, and now I'm kind of coming back more closely to the question of pro-Palestinian organizing, the other word that this has happened with is antisemitism. Because, we had in the UK, although it's not only in the UK, I know it has purchase across Europe also, we had the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of antisemitism, which makes the provision that criticism of Israel is in itself anti-Semitic. And this, at the time when many organizations, including educational organizations, were asked to accept this definition, and I say asked, it might be more accurate to say sort of strong-armed into accepting this definition. When they were asked to do that, they many of them responded by saying, oh, but hang on, this is a huge problem for academic freedom, because of course, like any state, Israel, absolutely should be criticized, as all states should be able to be criticized. And what this essentially does is make special provision, for the state or the entity that calls itself the State of Israel, to be sort of beyond criticism in that way. And many organizations responded by adopting the definition alongside other definitions, for instance, the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism, which tries to sort of stop that problem for academic freedom by trying to say, well, there are types of criticism of the State of Israel that might be anti-Semitic, for instance, those that criticize its Jewishness specifically, or use anti-Semitic tropes, for instance, to characterize the behavior of its leaders. But there are also those criticisms of Israel that, of course, would not be anti-Semitic. For instance, those that would want to criticize its genocidal behavior towards the Palestinian people. So what happened was that definition, the IHRA definition, made it really difficult to distinguish between those types of criticism that are anti-Semitic and those that aren't, because it essentially hollowed out the word anti-Semitism of its meaning. And we are now living, I think, with the consequences of what happens if you hollow out the word anti-Semitism of its meaning. This is something that, first and foremost, is extraordinarily dangerous for Jewish people. We live in a world of rising anti-Semitism, just as we live in a world of rising Islamophobia. And to remove the tool, that's to say the understanding of anti-Semitism that was functioning as the tool by which people could be protected, from this very vile, form of very dangerous and often violent prejudice, is a really extraordinarily dangerous thing to do, particularly when there is then added to that all of this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric that various, Israeli politicians often come out with, which suggests that Jewish safety is somehow premised on the genocide of the Palestinians, which is itself going to cause, further anti-Semitism to rise. So we lost something enormous, I think, when we hollowed out the word anti-Semitism of its meaning in order to weaponize it, so that it would become impossible, or at least much more difficult, to criticize Israel. But what we can see, if we put this term anti-Semitism into the context of this term Intifada, and into the context of what I've said about the term woman, at least in the UK, what we see is that this isn't a one-off thing. This is something that fascism repeatedly does. Victor Klemperer knew it best because he lived under it. But we ought to, I think, be very, very wary when we see this happening, when we see words being kind of voided of their meaning in this way, when we see those in power trying to dictate what words mean, particularly when the meaning that they give to those words is very, very different to the way that that the interpretive communities of those words would use them, right? And I think this is for me the biggest warning flag, that the trial of Elias D'Imzalène is waving for us, not just in France, not just in Europe, but around the world. We're living, of course, in a world of global Islamophobia. It's not something that's restricted to Europe or the so-called West. The flag that it's waving is, I think, the flag of fascism. I think it's forcing us to ask the question, how do we resist the way that fascism hollows out words of their meaning and tells us what our words mean? Because we will, if we don't resist that, lose, as we lost with anti-Semitism, ways of condemning prejudice, standing against prejudice, creating more just societies, more equal societies. And if you'll just permit me one final example of this process in full swing, which is the very recent list that Donald Trump released of words that were no longer going to be permitted to be used in research that's carried out using public money in the United States. And this was a fascinating list because, I mean, it's extraordinarily damaging to people's research careers. Let's just say that very quickly, that people have lost research funding to carry out what were extremely important projects in the US. This is not a small phenomenon. It's extremely large, extremely worrying, extremely damaging to academic freedom. But the way that this has been done is actually around the question of what words mean, because Donald Trump and his administration released this list of words that you couldn't use in your research if you wanted your research to continue to receive public money. And on that list were all the words you would imagine a sort of revanchist administration that wanted to roll back the progress that has been made around questions of diversity, equality, and inclusion, over the last 10 years. We can argue about how much real progress has been made, but it's clear that administration wants to roll back whatever, even meager progress there has been. So all the words you would expect if you understood that administration to be one that wants to roll back that progress are on that list, right? Words to do with race and ethnicity are on the list. For example, words that would stop you from studying queer history, for instance, are on the list too. All the ones you would expect are there. But the word I didn't expect to see, naively, was the word historical. And that's because, I think, of this presumption that when we study the history of things, we're doing something really very radical, right? That we're doing something that jeopardizes the ahistorical kind of presumptions that the Trump administration, is kind of living under and is sort of sending out into the world. And that makes me then also reflect back on this word intifada, because what we've done here in order to read the politics of the case against Elias D'Imzalène and also the politics of fascism's, increasing control of language around the world, what we've done is actually invest the word with its history. Not its history as in its etymology, not the history of the letters that make up the word, but the history of interpretive communities and the way those communities have used that word. And I think in that sense, it's very clear what Donald Trump's opposition to the idea of the historical is, because it's only with that historical that we can reinvest the word with all the various kinds of meaning that are hollowed out of it by fascism that wants to weaponize it, in order to stop, in the case of the word intifada, at least, in order to stop us from understanding the liberation movement of the Palestinians as fundamentally speaking an anti-colonial liberation movement, and as one that is absolutely, in solidarity with all of the other kinds of anti-colonial liberation movements, not just now, but across the history of the world. So when we talk about the philological argument, I think what we're also really talking about is the history of words and the history of meanings. And I think we live in a moment where part of what it means to resist fascism is to refuse to be ahistorical, is to use the words we have in their wide and varied range of meanings for as long as we're able to, because what you see, obviously, with this kind of linguistic fascism is you see sort of preemptive compliance, right? You see people saying, even though it's not illegal for me to say from the river to the sea, I'm not going to say it in case someone accuses me of meaning by it something that I don't mean by it. And that's, of course, how language shrinks. And it's how language becomes less powerful And we should always be reminded, I think, that if fascism is trying to control language, that's because language is an extremely important weapon. It's one of the only weapons that we have, and it's one that we increasingly need to use. And that's, I think, what's radical about philology. Philology teaches us how to reinvest language with meaning, how to make language meaningful in ways that are resistant. I never thought I'd find myself, someone making the case for philology, given everything I said at the beginning of our conversation about how philology has also been, so closely entangled with racism and prejudice of various kinds. But we're in a moment also when philology, radical philology, critical philology, whatever we want to prefix it with, is also going to be, I think, our weapon against fascism. So I think it's time that we learn to use it.
Absolutely. It sounds like what your analysis does is foreground and highlight how language is a tool of liberation, just as it is a tool of suppression and repression in the case of the Nazi use of language in the Third Reich, or the contemporary policing of language and banning of words because of their troubling, consequences for people seeking freedom, seeking to understand reality, that the Trump administration's banned word list for researchers really exposes. And I think it's very important what you pointed out. To me also, the word historical was the most absurd one, but yet when you think about it, you can understand, just as you were explaining and elaborating, why that's such a dangerous word, because it is a word that describes an approach to understanding, or at least attempting to understand reality, that stands against the fabrication of the fascist approach to manufacturing a different kind of reality by changing the meanings of words, hollowing them out of their meaning, as you were explaining in the case of anti-Semitism. And I think the best example of the abuse of that word, the hollowing out, but it's not even the hollowing out of the word anti-Semitism of its meaning as a naming of a form of bigotry and prejudice against Jews that needs to be combated, is the fact that they've substituted, or at least created the space in the US congressional discussions on adopting the IHRA definition in order to protect Israel state policy and its actions, genocidal actions against the Palestinians. That's something that they want to have enforced. But because many of the constituencies that are supporting Israel through Christian Zionism are these extreme evangelical communities that still want to maintain their characteristic hostility towards Jews as Jews because of their theological difference with Christian doctrine, that they wanted to preserve the possibility still to name Jews as killers of Christ, right? So this is as deicides. So this anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish component of certain forms of extreme Christian theology that are adopted by and nurtured in these very right-wing Christian evangelical communities was meant to be exempted from the definition of anti-Semitism. So the paradigmatic case, historically speaking, of when we really talk about a move from anti-Jewishness as just a theological component of Christian, doctrinal culture, in contrast to a previous precursor, religious community, into anti-Semitism, is often associated with things with the claim that Jews were the killers of Christ. So the paradigmatic example for anti-Semitism and its emergence historically in the West is now, exempted and substituted for criticism of the state of Israel, right? So this is, truly outrageous. And I think, in some sense, what you've been suggesting here is something I've heard you say, and perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on this, that why we should care about philology, about words in, the struggle for liberation. is something that Edward Said said, and I've heard you quote him saying that philology is jihad. Maybe you can explain a little bit more of what he meant by that. Why was he the person who is most associated with the literary study and the cultural study and theoretical and conceptual understanding of the way in which Western identity has manufactured itself through creating a fantastical form of knowledge and portrayal and representation of the East, which has furthered the colonial project, white supremacy, and so on, is Edward Said in his famous book, Orientalism. Why would he be committed to a discipline that he himself has critiqued precisely on the grounds that we've been talking about, the fixed way of thinking about cultural characteristics, civilizational identities as intimately associated and connected necessarily with language, right? So, why did he say that? What do you think he meant by that? And how is that something that the pro-Palestine movement should understand as authorizing and, in fact, even requiring a very precise anti-fascistic, historicist understanding of language and words and how they come to mean what they do?
So Edward Said was very, very proudly a philologist. And, there are numerous opportunities he had to say what a proud philologist he was, very openly. He was also, in my view, and my very partisan view, the best critic of the problems of philology, partly, and something he could do, partly because he was absolutely rooted, within that tradition of philology. Orientalism, as you say, his 1978 book, is an absolutely fascinating book because it deals with the problems caused by philologists. I mean, the villains in Orientalism are, on the one hand, the Orientalists, on the other hand, classicists to a lesser extent. And of course, there's huge overlap between those disciplines. The one Orientalism that describes the kind of troped and demeaned East, the other one, classics or classical studies, which describes the kind of idealized ancient West. Those are two sides of the same coin, in my view, Orientalism and classics or classical studies. But the other kind of big villain in Edward Said's work is the philologist. And he talks about the way that philology, particularly those kind of family tree type structures of languages that I was making reference to when we began this conversation, he talks about the way that those linguistic family trees were also taken as both racial and also civilizational family trees. So this was, as many people have now written, this was extraordinarily useful to the colonial project. When Britain, for instance, goes to colonize India, what transpires is a kind of philological enterprise that is about trying to argue that, British colonizers have a right to be in India because of the linguistic closeness between Sanskrit and Greek, for instance. So Proto-Indo-European really comes out of that moment of wanting to make the case that there is precedent for white colonial. Let's leave aside the obvious question, which is, were the Greeks really white? To which the answer is no, of course not. Let's leave that aside for a moment. The idea of the colonial project was to kind of make that case philologically by saying, look, we are part of this Proto-Indo-European family that includes Sanskrit, that includes ancient Greek. And that became a sort of map for all of world history. I mean, it's an extraordinarily powerful thing. It leaves the Muslim, without ancestor within the history of the world. So it causes a specifically Islamophobic problem, but it also creates this kind of civilizational understanding of the world that was incredibly important to the colonial project. And Edward Said is absolutely able to diagnose precisely this at the same time as he, towards the end of his career, in Humanism and Democratic Criticism, where he comes back, his final book, where he comes back to the question of what humanism can do. and also comes back to the question of philology. And he ends up talking about philology as if it were a kind of jihad, and thinking of philology as something that is liberatory. So by that, he doesn't mean, he hasn't come full circle and decided that actually we do need these family trees. We do need to understand that Sanskrit and Greek are kind of siblings in the great Western family tree. Of course not. Of course, he's still critical of that. But he is able to understand that if philology is the sort of science, I'm making air quotes to suggest that it's a kind of pretense to scientific objectivity. If it is the science that has kind of curated the relational networks or the kind of map of relation on which Western supremacy rests, and with it Eurocentrism, Islamophobia, racism, all of those various kinds of things. If philology has been that, then he's really asking the question, well, how else do we organize philology then? And this isn't just a sort of, we don't want to throw out the the scientific baby with the colonial bathwater. It's not just that argument. It's really a much more interesting argument, which says, look, if philology is the discipline that has mapped out relation, in the Eurocentric colonial world order in which we live, then might philology be able to be the way in which we remap that relation in service of a much more, justice focused or liberatory world? And I think that is a really important way of thinking about tools, because we often, and I'm sure you've had this experience, Adnan, of being in sort of conferences where people will say things like, they'll repeat that the famous quote that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I think there is this sort of tendency for, decolonial scholars, or those scholars who want to do this important work of reorganizing relation in favor of a more liberatory world. There's this tendency to sort of think we have to throw out everything that the colonial has ever touched, in order to attain some kind of, prelapsarian pure thing that's never touched by coloniality. And, first of all, a large question would be, is that possible? That's a much larger question than we can go into now. But the other question, and I think that the question that Said is asking when he comes back to philology, is not so much, well, can't the colonial do anything good, but by which tools was the colonial established as natural, right? By which tools was this world order in which we live, or did this world order in which we live become the only way we could ever have imagined living? And is it possible to use those tools to, first of all, unpick that world order, and then to, by organizing relation differently, in anti-colonial ways, in justice-focused ways, is it possible then to imagine a different world? And I think that's really the conclusion that Said comes to. And a lot of that later work of Said's is often, some people will say it's kind of a little bit disappointing. A lot of people don't like the way he returns to humanism in particular, for instance. And I'm not sure myself that I particularly like the way he returns to humanism, but I do like the way that he returns to philology, because it takes philology away from that way of fixing philology as only this science of kind of family trees of languages. And I guess the one thing that I would just add is that all of this, unthinking of philology, rethinking of philology as jihad, all of this, Orientalism, critique of Orientalism, 1978, all of this he did while also doing it in the context of Palestine and Palestinian liberation, right? I think it's often forgotten that those three books, that Edward Said wrote in that 1978 moment, first of all, Orientalism, the question of Palestine, and covering Islam, those books are essentially a sort of trilogy where he is thinking through the way the colonial world order produces Orientalism and Islamophobia. And he's thinking those things through by looking at them through the prism of the question of Palestine. The question of Palestine comes out, only a year after Orientalism. But we don't often read those two things together. We see his Palestine work as is somehow more activist than his literary critical work or his philological work. And I think the lesson, for philologists, but also for, those who are part of the anti-genocide movement, the movement for Palestinian liberation, I think could sometimes do well to remember that those two parts of his career that are seen as different tracks are actually, very, very close together in time and are also interrelated. He talks throughout Orientalism about Palestine. He talks throughout his philological work about Palestine too. And so, I'm not saying that his solution is perfect. In fact, I'm in the process of writing a book about something I think he leaves out of his work. So, I'm not here to say Edward Said had all of the answers, but I do think what he was able to do was understand that if we want to have a free Palestine, one of the things we need to be able to do is think in radical ways about language, and we need to be able to resist the way that our ability to speak certain things into existence, even to speak a free Palestine into existence, is being restricted by fascism, is being restricted by the mechanics, by which we're being told language should be understood. So there is, I think, within Said's work, an activist project, not just for philologists, although I do think more philologists should be activists. It's been one of my huge disappointments. That's not even a strong enough word, but one of my kind of something that's made me enormously lose faith in academia as a space for free thinking has been the extraordinary lack of ability to condemn the genocide of the Palestinians coming out of literary critical organizations, philological organizations, historiographical organizations, scholarly organizations more generally, who I think will, look back, as everyone now does with apartheid South Africa, will look back on this moment and be wanting to pretend like they had always been against this. I think it's a real kind of stain on the idea that academia could stand for academic freedom. But I think what we learn from Edward Said is the kind of counter thought to that feigned apolitical stance that many scholarly organizations have taken. The reason why he was such a great philologist and the reason why he was so able to think against something like Orientalism, he's not, of course, the first to think against Orientalism, but the reason he was able to do that was precisely because he understood that words are always political. And the way that meaning is made is always political. The question of who gets to make linguistic meaning is always political. And I'm very much, reminded of that as I read the information about the trial of Elias D'Imzalène, which seems to be, again, reminding us of the incredible political power of language and also of the incredible attempts to restrict that political power at the same time.
I want to thank you so much for those closing remarks, as well as all the analysis that you've given about how studying and understanding the meaning of words can be a tool in liberation, and how it's precisely because of that we see people being targeted for their use because they don't want them to be able to articulate these thoughts in the compelling language, in vivid language, that can convert to political action. It's very threatening. And so it's very important that scholars such as yourselves, with the kind of training in the languages and the methods of understanding how words are used and make meaning, contribute this analysis on behalf of pro-Palestine and larger liberation. And I want to encourage all of our listeners to go ahead and check out Ryan Freshy's report from February earlier this year on the Reorient blog site, where he talks about the case. The link will be in the description. But before we close, Chella, perhaps you can tell listeners how and watchers how they might be able to follow your work and keep up with what you're doing, the many things that you're doing. Where should people go to find more of your work?
Well, you can find me on socials, almost all socials. My social handle is Luxmea, so at Luxmea. That's what it is on Twitter/X. I sort of change it slightly depending on which social profile we're talking about. So I'm Luxmea Gram on Instagram. I'm Luxmea Talk on TikTok. I also have Blue Sky. But if you put in those three letters, Luxmea, in most socials, you'll probably turn me up at some point. I also maybe want to encourage you to follow a scholarly society that I set up precisely because I was so let down by scholarly societies that hadn't spoken out against the genocide of the Palestinians. It's called the Society for the Study of the Past. You can also find it on Blue Sky and Instagram. It's a place for doing history against occupation. and in solidarity with the occupied and the oppressed. So what we're trying to do with that society is make it clear that there is no such thing as apolitical history. In fact, it is both silly and undesirable to think about apolitical history. History is always political, and history is also crucial for how we imagine a better future for everyone. And that's kind of the sort of founding principles of the society. So you're very welcome to follow us there as well. And can I also just in closing encourage you, this is obviously a conversation that Adnan and I were able to have because of having been at the same day on the encampment at Radboud University. So can I also encourage you, particularly if you're an academic, but really wherever you are, whoever you are, to be in solidarity with those students, to support those students who are doing this incredible work of trying to stand against the genocide of the Palestinians and trying to call to account their institutions, that for too long have been complicit in Israel's genocide against the Palestinians and in various other forms of coloniality and oppression. So I want us to remember where this conversation comes from. It comes from those incredible activist spaces of learning that students are responsible for. Those are the spaces that are at the moment giving me huge amounts of hope, for the future of academic learning, because those are hugely educational spaces, just as protests are hugely educational spaces. So, follow me on socials, follow the society on socials, but please follow and support those students who are doing that work too, where you can.
Absolutely. And I think since you're involved with this project of a counter-professional organization to do historical work, yes, Donald Trump, historical work, perhaps we can have you back on at some point in the near future to talk about that effort, and maybe we can invite one or two others who are involved and really talk about what history means for liberation. And of course, as listeners on this and viewers of this channel know, I also have a podcast, Guerrilla History, that is dedicated to the use of history for liberatory struggle. And maybe it could be a combo episode with that. But I think that's a very fruitful line of inquiry. I hope we can have further discussions about that in the future. And again, I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for coming on today.
I would love that. Thank you so much, inshallah. That sounds amazing. And thank you all so much for having me. And thanks for all of the listeners for their patience as well. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Listeners, that's it for this episode. I wish you all peace and solidarity. You can follow this channel. Please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Get the word out there. I think today we had a conversation that I think everybody in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement, or who's interested and concerned with how to oppose fascism that is not creeping. Why do I say creeping? It's in full flower around us. So we need all the tools we can get. And this is a very useful conversation that I hope you will find helpful. Until next time, peace and solidarity.